Max, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that wonderful introduction. I certainly appreciate it. And good afternoon, everybody. As Mike said, I'm Max Menke. I'm one of the founding partners of GrowthX. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about, what I find is, most important question on everybody's radar for startups, which is finding product market fit. What is it? Where does it come from? And, why does it matter to me? And those seem like relatively straightforward questions, but as we'll talk about today, they're oftentimes overlooked and have an absolutely huge impact on what we do as entrepreneurs. A little bit about GrowthX. We're a seed stage venture capital fund based out of San Francisco. We have 2 funds. We invest in B2B SaaS businesses. And our fund thesis, if you want to call it such a lofty thing, is just that we think that entrepreneurs are a lot more successful when they focus their time and energy and effort on raising capital in the form of revenue from these strange people called customers. And when we really get intentional about carving out that time and dedicating that effort, that, entrepreneurs are able to protect their runway. They're able to shorten sales cycles. They're able to make it easier to acquire venture capital dollars because they have a comprehensive traction narrative. And really, most importantly, for every entrepreneur, they're able to keep more of their own business in their pocket and not give it away to somebody else who's just giving them, a fraction of their own, net worth to be a part of their journey. So, this is being recorded. I'm going to be sharing the slide deck afterwards as well. And there's also going to be some exercises for people to dive in. We always want this to be actionable and tractionable as possible. I know we've got a little bit of a tight hour here, but I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions that anybody may have. And of course, if anybody has any questions, feel free to, fill up the chat and ask away. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and let's start talking a little bit about product market fit. So to start this session off, one of the important things to know is why we need to talk about product market fit. And this is the same reason why we launched GrowthX. So I started it back in 2015. We all know that the vast majority of startups fail. That's not anything new. We're all fairly, risky entrepreneurs. But the challenge is, for a lot of us, is we don't actually know why startups fail. I mean, it's almost gotten to a point where failure is the reason, right? Well, how come you gave up on your startup? We failed, right? Well, thankfully, there's a large number of organizations that actually drill into the reasons why startups fail. I mean, CB Insights, Wilbur Labs, Startup Genome, any one of these organizations do annual surveys of why startups fail. And what was true back in 2015, unfortunately, is unchanged still in 2021. And the problem is actually getting worse. The reasons why startups fail have almost nothing to do with products, and they have everything to do with markets and people. If you look at the number one reason why startups fail, it's very straightforward. They run out of cash. I mean, the most recent study, 37% of startups fail because they run out of cash. So you're running your business, you're spending your time on your pitch deck, on your product, but the one thing that's most likely to stall your business, right, which is cash, you're probably not solving for enough each day, which is how do I acquire revenue to protect my runway? And so, the accelerator community, the coaching community, the academic community, it provides plenty of resources and insights from, how to incorporate your business and IP lawyers, how to build products and fundraise. But when you look at the primary reasons why startups fail, and you look at the tools that entrepreneurs are given to actually be successful, which is go-to-market strategy, there's an incredible disconnect. And so what it ends up unearthing is the vast majority of startups fail because they simply don't know how to get to market. And what we see is the result of years and years of hacking and hustling mentality, whatever that means, and the true result of go-to-market strategy by Google search result, by Googling cold email campaigns and pricing strategies, 3 tips that I use to go from 0 to 100 million that are great marketing and clickbait, but unfortunately aren't terribly effective for your everyday entrepreneur to take control of their business and to decide where revenue is going to come from. So to address that issue, as Mike, pointed out, we created a programmatic approach to help our entrepreneurs stop improvising and start going to market with intent. And we call that program the Market Acceleration Program. It's not an accelerator or a cohort or a batch or anything that anyone has to apply for. It's a proven methodology to just say, listen, there are a lot of different products and markets out there, but most of us are going to take a similar path to product market fit. And as we invest in companies, we want to work with companies that value traction. And so since we've been doing this, since I've been working with companies, I've been doing this for quite a few years, with companies in China, with companies here, with companies in Canada, companies that are, idea stage, 2 kids, in a garage, all the way up to Fortune 500 brands like Bridgestone and Firestone and Canon. We've accelerated fintech companies, health tech companies, esports companies, gov tech companies, nonprofits, for-profits, B2B, B2C. We've even accelerated a autonomous robotic fish that has a camera on its head. It swims around fisheries and uses AI to say, hey, maybe the fish aren't doing so well, or maybe it's time to harvest them, whatever it might be. And through all of that experience, what I can share with you is that while products and markets are certainly unique, the path to finding product market fit is not. It's a formula. Now, don't get me wrong, just because it's a formula, I'm certainly not suggesting that it's easy. It's hard, but there's a huge difference in it being hard without any framework to do and improvising it, and it being hard to do once you actually know where the goalposts are, once you know what you should be spending your incredibly limited time, runway, and resources are, and avoiding putting your time down, rabbit holes and sinkholes. And one of the challenges that we run into with a lot of entrepreneurs, and I run into it myself with a lot of venture capitalists and accelerator programs, is this term product market fit. It is something that we all talk about. It's something that we all are in search of, but it's incredibly intangible. For most of us, it's a feeling. And I ask entrepreneurs this, I ask my colleagues in the venture capital space who say, well, this company's pre-product market fit or post-product market fit. And I just ask them, okay, define it for me. What is it? And I'd ask you all the same question. How do you know you have product market fit? How will you know if you think that you don't have it right now? And you can certainly Google product market fit, and you're going to get 800 blog posts, and half of them will quote, the world's greatest VC, Mark Andreessen, saying product market fit's the most important thing in the world. That's wonderful, but that's not a definition. And the other half will quote, the author of Lean Startup, Eric Ries, saying, if you have to ask if you have product market fit, well, then you don't have it. Again, very wise sounding, but I don't know what to do with that. And so let's just think about this practically for a moment. We're up late, we're up early, we're spending time away from our friends and our family and our kids, and we're not going on vacation, we're working on these crazy hours in search of a place that is about as tangible as achieving nirvana, right? Nobody has it really defined. And in what other aspect of our life would that be acceptable? In what other aspect of your life would it be acceptable to put all your time and energy towards a goal that you can't actually measure or get a sense of? And also just thinking about this practically, how are you going to successfully design the path to product market fit if you don't know where the destination is that you're going towards? I mean, all due respect to Mark Zuckerberg and his infamous saying, move fast and break things. When we're trying to move quickly towards an intangible object, it's like getting in our car, throwing out our phone, blindfolding ourselves and slamming our foot on the gas, expecting that we're going to reach a destination that's investable or scalable. It's just not very practical. So when we talk about not improvising, we talk about going to market with intent, we have to start breaking down the pieces of this grand experiment called entrepreneurship into tangible parts that us as entrepreneurs can control and control for. And I'll get back to our definition of product market fit in a moment, but when we think about intentionality, what I'm really talking about is the scientific method, right? As an entrepreneur, you are a scientist. You are simply just trying to answer a question. And that question, as it relates to product market fit, is there a market and is it scalable? And oftentimes what we do is we lay our company or our product down at the feet of the market, and we say the market will decide. Well, that's a very let's throw mud at the wall and see what sticks approach. Well, scientist doesn't do that. A scientist doesn't pour a little bit of chemical A and a little bit of chemical B into a beaker and light it on fire and say, well, we'll see what happens. No, that's how a scientist burns his or her eyebrows off, right? A scientist knows exactly how much of chemical A and exactly how much of chemical B and exactly how long and how hot that fire is going to burn for. And before a scientist ever runs an experiment, she does two incredibly intentional things. Number one, a scientist doesn't run the experiment first and ask questions later or observe later. A scientist knows that the experiment's going to create data, so they implement the tools to objectively observe the experiment and collect data before the experiment starts. Make no mistake, scientists don't bring feelings to the data fight, and neither should we as entrepreneurs. We have to start chasing these feelings. We have to start chasing, oh, well, this person's interested, right? And we have to start actually tracking metrics to see, are we getting the result that we expected to get through all these different motions, whether that be marketing or sales or customer development or interviews. The second thing that a scientist does before, again, they ever even start an experiment is they create a hypothesis. And a hypothesis, a lot like product market fit, it's a term that's used often but not really appreciated. Hypothesis is just an expected outcome if ideal conditions are met. So our expected outcome is to find product market fit, and we have to define what that would be. And once we have a tangible definition, well, then we can start to picture, well, what would be the ideal conditions for us to achieve that? And that's how we design the experiment. That's how we design the pricing model and the messaging and the go-to-market strategy. But if we don't know what we're optimizing for, if we don't know what that ideal endpoint is that we're running with the experiment, then how are we supposed to design the experiment and take things to market? So this is when we talk at GrowthX with companies that are running through the MXP, companies that we've accelerated both inside and outside of our portfolio, when we talk about product market fit, our definition is that product market fit is simply your ability to acquire revenue using a proven and predictable method. We call it a traction narrative. It's not about acquiring a deal from your cousin or your mom. It's not about a flashpoint piece of revenue. It's being able to demonstrate that you've created a process, that you can execute that process repeatedly and predictably, and you can achieve that ideal outcome. And the only outcome that matters here is revenue. And you can do that predictably and repeatably. And a funny thing happens when you have a process and you can repeat that process, that big shiny object that every single one of us entrepreneurs is constantly worried about, scale, it becomes a natural byproduct. Because when you have process and that process is repeatable, well, that's the foundation upon which you need and you're able to scale. But if you don't have a process, and if that process isn't repeatable, well, when you hit that scale button, the only thing you're going to scale is friction. As much as, and again, I'll pick on Mark Zuckerberg here, move fast and break things. Most of us aren't, backed by Andreessen Horowitz and have, brilliant scientists and tens of millions of dollars behind us. We have to protect our runway. We have to be able to acquire knowledge and learning and capital so that we can stay on the field. And there's an old sports adage that I love to use. The best ability is availability. That's true for athletes, and it's also true for entrepreneurs. And when we think about at GrowthX, the difference between an everyday entrepreneur and an entrepreneur who's actually on a hyper growth path to becoming a unicorn, the biggest difference actually isn't that they're moving quickly. The biggest difference and what we can point to as the most significant contributor to their success is that they actually start off by moving incredibly slowly and intentionally. By the way, this is something that the Navy SEALs have known for decades, if not a century now. The Navy SEALs have a saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. What does that mean? Well, for the Navy SEALs, when they get assigned a mission, they don't just jump out of the helicopter and start firing bullets and everybody runs whichever direction they want to run, right? If they do that, if they don't know who they're up against, what they're up against, where they're going, what the extraction plan is, which specialists to bring, well, then when the bullets start flying, they're going to be very inefficient, and therefore they're going to be very ineffective in accomplishing their mission. Well, your company's the same thing. Your market is the mission, right? And acquiring that market is the mission. And if you're not sure which market you're in, and if you're not sure how you're going to attack that market, you're not going to have the right pricing strategy or the right marketer or team or the right go-to-market strategy. And so what we have to do is we have to go slowly. We have to plan. We have to plan our route of attack. We have to plan which specialists we're going to bring. We have to ask questions to identify, is this the best path forward, so that when we are in that mission, when we're out in the field, we're not strategizing, we're executing. And when we're executing, we're not wasting precious cycles, precious weeks, precious runway, pivoting and iterating in directions that are actually moving us further away from the target. And so the most important part of this, and again, I'll go back to the target part of this, the most important aspect of finding product market fit is, again, we're trying to acquire revenue. And in order to do that, we need to focus on having a succinct and a clear and a hyper-targeted ideal customer profile, or ICP. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with the concept of the ICP, or you've heard of an ICP before. But in my experience working with hundreds and hundreds of founders, the ICP is the single most poorly understood asset that any business has. I mean, typically when I speak with entrepreneurs and we're doing due diligence on those companies, and as a venture capital fund, we see companies every single day, and I ask them, who's your ICP? You don't receive a tangible answer. You receive an answer like, well, our ICP is manufacturers, or our ICP is moms. Moms, there's no moms ICP. Moms is a huge, you just addressed almost half the human population. Moms, it's a huge total addressable market. Same thing with manufacturers. Are you a large scale or small scale manufacturer? Are you manufacturing heavy machinery or tiny plastic spoons? And the reason why this is important is because at the end of the day, the most important asset that any business has, let alone the most important asset that any startup has, is your ICP. Why? Well, it's not rocket science. Your ICP dictates and directly impacts every single one of the known steps that you have to take to acquire revenue. Once you know your ideal customer profile, that's going to give you the ballpark for your pricing strategy. That's going to inform your customer acquisition costs. That's going to inform the available customer acquisition strategies that fit within that CAC. Those strategies will inform the medium and the channel to which you try to acquire those ideal customer profiles. And oh, by the way, your messaging has to be directly in line with your ICP, or else it just simply won't resonate. And so when we talk about your ICP, we have to understand that the goal of all of this, the reason why you're creating your ICP, is at the end of the day, You have to sell something to somebody. You have to market something to somebody. And the challenge that I run into for most entrepreneurs is that they don't really have a great understanding of what selling is. And a lot of the times we're entering conversations to talk about our product features or AI or ML, or our team and our history and the brand logos that we came from, when we should be entering conversations to validate those ICP hypotheses and to seek fit. Are you who I think you are? Do you do your job the way that I think you do it? When you do that job, does it take you into these rabbit holes that create these problems? But it's impossible to ask those questions if we don't even understand who our ideal customer profile is. And the reason we want to seek fit is really simple. It's a trick that any good sales organization, any good marketing team has known for thousands of years. Selling and marketing is helping. You're looking to solve somebody's problems. Nobody goes out into the market looking for a data provider. They go out into the market trying to solve a data problem, and they come across data providers. So what exactly goes into that ICP? Well, again, it's not this broad profile of industries or even companies. And where I run into friction with a lot of entrepreneurs is that lack of understanding that it's a customer profile. It's not a company profile, because at the end of the day, businesses don't buy anything. Businesses never have, and they never will, right? Google doesn't buy software. Nike doesn't buy software. Somebody at those companies buys software or buys hardware or buys services. And so your job as an entrepreneur is really simple: to get down into that subatomic layer, to understand who is the person that you're solving a problem for. Get inside their shoes, use empathy and curiosity and business acumen to understand their keystrokes, their workflow, and trying to understand in a very intimate sense, how does your product and your features impact the way that they do their job today? And once you understand how they do their job, then you can understand the problems and the business impact of those problems. And what you can do is to seek fit to solve those problems and identify whether or not it's worth your time to spend any more effort on that ideal customer profile. Because make no mistake, I certainly appreciate the entrepreneur journey. Every single one of us has 3 full-time jobs, product development, market development, and fundraising. And let's be honest with ourselves. How many of us take market development and treat that as a side activity, as a pet project, really, when it should be treated as a priority, right? So one thing to keep in mind as we're coming up with those ideal customer profiles is that for a lot of us, we're challenged to pick an ideal customer profile because there's fear of missing out, there's fear of a better option, there's shiny object syndrome, and it's no wonder why those things exist. Every single company I've ever met and worked with has, slide 17, $6 trillion total addressable market. And that is wonderful. Of course, as a venture capitalist, that gets me really excited to work with you. But at the same time, my advice to all of you is to take your total addressable market and leave it on the investor pitch deck and never bring it into the go-to-market strategy. Because your total addressable market is an incredibly wide, diverse array of dozens, if not hundreds, of unique ideal customer profiles. And each of them have different needs, different wants, different product readiness, different maturity, different sales cycles, different prices. And so while it might feel like, well, I don't want to leave anybody off the table, at the end of the day, if you try to be something to everybody, you're going to have a really difficult time running that experiment. You're going to have a really difficult time separating the signal from the noise. And you're going to have a very difficult time doing the most important thing, which is acquiring learning and revenue and creating predictability. Because if your ideal customer profile keeps changing, that means that process to acquire those customers will keep changing. And you'll be able to reach that scalability. So all that is to say, it's not about, when we're talking about finding product market fit, it's not about finding Mr. or Mrs. Right. It's about focusing on who is Mr. or Mrs. right now, the most stage relevant of all possible ideal customer profiles for your business. You shouldn't be focusing on acquiring your TAM. If you're successful, acquiring your TAM will be a natural byproduct of acquiring your beachhead and focusing on that beachhead as your first step. So you have to keep in mind, as you're thinking about who is Mr. or Mrs. right now, what's the stage of your product? What's the stage, what's the bandwidth of your team? How much revenue do you need to acquire by when from how many customers given your runway and sales cycles? And once you put all those pieces together, you're able to pretty tangibly start to break down that list into a narrow group of ICPs that make the most sense for you to start focusing your efforts towards. Now, one of the things that we use to prioritize looking at ICPs is, as I said before, to really understand who our customers are and to understand what the purpose of all these conversations are, which is to acquire revenue. It's not about acquiring interest. It's not about getting people to nod their head and say, wow, what you did is really, really great. When you're spending time, when our entrepreneurs are spending time in the MXP building these strategies, when they're spending time interviewing potential customers, the ultimate goal is to acquire revenue. So as you are giving time on your calendar, on your incredibly precious calendar, away to people, you should only be doing that to people who help further your mission, your goal to acquire either learning or revenue. And you should only give time away to people who share your worldview, or to people who are the lowest hanging fruit, right? To help you protect that runway and demonstrate process and repeatability. So what do I mean by worldview? It's really, really quite simple. In most industries, it's pretty easy to identify who is already deploying capital. If I have to choose between having a conversation with somebody who's deploying budget and I can see that they're deploying budget, or somebody who is tight-fisted, which one should I have a conversation with? Well, obviously the former, right? Now, that's not necessarily totally, easily searchable and filterable on the internet. But if you take a holistic approach, if you take a slow, smooth, and smooth the fast approach to qualifying out bad conversations and qualifying in good ones, or bad ICPs and good ones, it's actually pretty easy to gather all the breadcrumbs that can really well inform your decision making. So what are some examples of worldview? Well, the most classic one is, right, Steve Blank and Crossing the Chasm. And if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. And what he talks about is, listen, at the early stage, you need to work with early adopters, people who inherently understand risk and reward, right? It's part of their business model. Well, unfortunately, on LinkedIn, there isn't a simple sort function to, or a LinkedIn badge that says, well, this company is an early adopter, right? So how do I find them? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. If you see a company that has a corporate venture capital unit, or an innovation team, or they invest in or sponsor or support accelerator programs, startup boot camps, etc., what does that express to you about their worldview? Do those companies do that out of the goodness of their heart? Absolutely not. Those companies are spending money on those activities. And almost every business in the world doesn't spend money unless they expect to see more of that money come back into the business with friends, right? So when they're building that corporate venture capital unit, or if they're sponsoring that accelerator program, they expect it to pay, they expect that investment to pay dividends back to them as they acquire new companies, as they identify potentially disruptive companies, as they identify new product features that they can give to their customers to increase market share. It's entirely economics driven. What are some other breadcrumbs you can be on the lookout for that are tangible to identify who is worth your time and who is not worth your time? Just simply scanning through a company's website. If you go to somebody's website and they talk about how they're innovative, you go to their mission page, they talk about how they're tech driven, how they're pushing the boundaries, You go to their blog, it's fresh, it's updated, and they've got a podcast, and you go and you read the LinkedIn profile of 10 of their executives, and all of them talk about how innovation and tech and all that wonderful stuff. All of those breadcrumbs that actually embraces change. And that's a huge thing. A company that embraces change is much more willing to work with a company like yours that is a change agent, that is a little less proven, but has, potentially big value. On the flip side, if you go to a company's website, it's got a couple of broken links. You scroll down to the bottom, it says copyright 2016. For some reason, they still have a link to their MySpace page. You go to their blog, they're announcing that they just hired a new CMO, but that blog post is in 2017, and then you look her up, and she left, 2 years ago. What do those behaviors indicate to you about what will it be like if you try to spend time convincing those people to change their behaviors or spend money on themselves, right? And make no mistake, when we're talking about product market fit, we are talking about sales and marketing and acquiring revenue. And I think one of the things that a lot of us entrepreneurs misunderstand and certainly don't appreciate about the journey, the customer journey that we go through, is that when you acquire a customer, to us as entrepreneurs, it feels like, wow, somebody just gave us revenue, someone gave us money. But that's not actually how it gets transacted. To the customer, whether you're B2B or B2C, to the customer, they look at it as they just made an investment in themselves. So when we're talking about you identifying companies that are worth your time, we're talking about looking for the breadcrumbs where we can tangibly see where companies have made those investments. Because if we can see a pattern of investment, if we can see a recognition of a business model where companies deploy capital to increase market share or to streamline their operations, they're much more likely then to do the same with us. And the last example I'll give of worldview is, an example of, theoretical example of, let's just imagine I was the entrepreneur of a blazing fast Wi-Fi solution for the airline industry. So you can finally stream HBO Max and YouTube TV and all these other wonderful things. Now, what most founders and entrepreneurs would do is go online, download a list of every airline, and just start shooting out cold emails and trying to get in front of their innovation teams, right? The problem is, what do we know as consumers about these airlines? Do they all treat us consumers the same way? Do they treat their airplanes the same way? Do they treat their pilots the same way? No, right? There's a huge difference. And that difference can provide you a valuable competitive advantage, a valuable way to shorten sales cycles and get the right context and learning back for your go-to-market strategy. So, for example, if we look at Singapore Airlines and United Arab Emirates, year in and year out, those airlines are ranked as best airlines in the world, best in-cabin amenities, best customer service, best customer experience, yada, 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 yada. Did that happen on accident? Did those companies, buy the ratings agencies out? Absolutely not. Those companies intentionally go out and they rip up their airplanes, they buy new technology, they upgrade, staff training. They are constantly spending money on their own product because they know if they continue to push the edge on the customer expectation, then they'll create a competitive advantage, which will help them make more money and increase revenue. That's their worldview. On the flip side, you look here in the States at a company like Spirit Airlines. Spirit Airlines isn't at the top of anybody's list other than worst airlines to fly on. A successful flight for Spirit Airlines is that they got you from point A to point B, and that your heart didn't stop beating. And if your luggage shows up, they give themselves a pat on the back, right? Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky. And this is a super common mistake that entrepreneurs make in a variety of different ways. Spirit Airlines doesn't have Wi-Fi on their flights right now. And what a lot of entrepreneurs do is they mistake that behavior as a buying signal. Well, everybody else has Wi-Fi. They don't have Wi-Fi, so they must know that they need Wi-Fi. So this is a perfect fit, right? It's the exact opposite. It's not like if you bumped into the CEO of Spirit Airlines in the street and you said, hey, by the way, did you know that every other airline on the planet has Wi-Fi and you're the only ones that don't? It's not like he would go, what? No one told me this. Everyone else has Wi-Fi. I've never even been on a plane that has Wi-Fi. Absolutely not. The CEO of Spirit Airlines is very well aware that when he's sending emails on his private jet powered by Wi-Fi, powered by the revenue acquired from his customers that don't have Wi-Fi, he's very well aware that he doesn't provide that service to his customers. That's their business model. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you try to go through the process and you look at those breadcrumbs and you don't see the big red light that says, this company does not spend on the same thing that your product, the same value your product is trying to create, you're going to spend a lot of cycles, a lot of capital, a lot of runway going down the wrong tree when you could be spending much more time being personalized and targeted with the right customers who do share your worldview, who do invest. And I don't mean invest capital in the venture capital sense. I mean, invest in the form of revenue for you. So as we're thinking about revenue and where does it come from, we also have to start, as we're crafting this ideal customer profile, we have to understand why companies buy and why people buy for the B2C stance. And all too often, our assumption as entrepreneurs, and I see this all the time, is that interest sells. If I overwhelm somebody with how great my product is and the pitch events that I won and all those wonderful things, people are going to go, wow, you have sliced bread. I want this, right? But tell me if you've ever heard or experienced this one before. You go and you meet with, a company, you roll them through your pitch deck, you do a little product demo, you wrap up the meeting, you go, I nailed all my talking points, we did everything right. And then they come over to you and they say, hey, this was really great. We're super interested in what you guys do. Can you send me a little bit of collateral? And what I'll do is I'm going to run it up the flagpole to the rest of the team and we'll get back to you. And you go, oh, that's awesome. That's a total buying signal, right? And then what happens? We don't ever hear anything back. Because again, we talked about what we do, but we never actually tied it down to one of the actual reasons that companies buy and the problems that your product solves for. And so for businesses don't buy because they like you or they think you're cool or they think what you're doing is hyper innovative. That's helpful, but it won't get the job done because businesses are rational organizations that are constrained by the only document that matters, which is the profit and loss statement. And so there's only 4 reasons why any business would ever buy anything. It's to make money, save money, acquire or grow a competitive advantage, or stay out of jail, be compliant. And all of them are economic drivers. So the challenge for you all is to understand not what your product does, but how does your product and the impact it has by changing the keystrokes within an organization, how does it help a business do one of these 4 things? Now, on the flip side, consumers are not constrained by this P&L. Consumers buy for entirely emotional reasons. I mean, perfect example being an iPhone, right? There are plenty of great phones out there that don't cost as much as an iPhone, but for a lot of folks, it's a status symbol. For others, they have a fear of using a different operating system. Still for some, it's really simple. All my friends text in blue. I don't want to be the person, texting in green and screwing up the group chat, right? And if you really want to get a masterclass of what I'm talking about, go and watch some good old-fashioned TV with these things called commercials. I know we're all on streaming devices these days. I'm certainly guilty of it, but I'm entirely serious, especially for the entrepreneurs here. Go and watch TV, watch commercials, put on the captions so that you can eat up every word. These professional marketers will teach you so much as you're just sitting on your couch watching The Bachelor, more than any, pitch competition could teach you. And the perfect example is, what we have here in the States, pharmaceutical ads, right? So when you see an ad for arthritis medicine, what you don't see are images of grandma in a dark room, laid up on her bed with ice bags on her knees. And you don't get a science lecture about how if you take this pill, it goes into your stomach and goes through your kidney and enters your bloodstream and attacks the arthritis nodes and all these other things. No, because nobody cares about that. What do you see when you see an arthritis commercial? You see grandma running in a field on a sunny day, holding her grandson's hand as a bad cover, wedding band version of I'm Walking on Sunshine plays in the background, right? What are they communicating, both visually and verbally? What they're communicating is that it's not that the arthritis medicine solves pain. What they're communicating is that the arthritis medicine gives grandma joy because the pain robs her of joy. If grandma didn't have any joy, the pain just adds on to the problem. But the truth is that when she has pain in her knee, she can't spend time with her grandson, and that's what makes her happy. And so you have to go beyond what your product does, and you have to look at impact. If I drop this product in my customer's hands, what else can they do? What are the things that their current situation and keystrokes prevent them from doing? It's the same thing going back to B2B. Great, you give someone a data solution. The data solution is going to then inform decisions. And your job is to figure out what specific decisions are going to be made, are going to be made better, are going to be made more thoughtfully. And how will those decisions help them do one of those four things? So when you're thinking about the relationship between why people buy and what your product does, the key word is impact. And trying to identify, again, not what your product does, but what does it do for this person? And as I said before, selling is helping. How does this actually help? And to go just one layer deeper, as I mentioned before, companies don't buy anything, right? We have to enter conversations, not to talk about our product, but to seek fit. And so the challenge that a lot of entrepreneurs have is that we don't actually have the clear line of sight to who buys and who is the economic buyer. And because of that, it becomes really difficult to ask questions, come up with hypotheses, and to seek fit. I mean, if I want to know, if I have product market fit or if I'm on the right path, I can't ask Google or Walmart or Nike, hey, what are your strategic goals for the rest of 2021? Google and Nike and Walmart are logos and characters with a specific font. But if I ask the head of North American retail real estate for Nike and Foot Locker and Champs Sports, what are their plans? How's the real estate market looking? Are you going to be expanding or contracting? That's a very specific title and a very specific role. And most importantly, each of those people have a very specific P&L. They have their own budget. And while there are many different customer profiles, champion buyers, your typical innovation officer, technical buyer, the user buyer, who's oftentimes, especially for B2B, the end buyer. While there are many different types of buyers, what we have to focus on is the person who has budget, who has the authority to invest in the company. And that person has very little idea how the sausage gets made within their organization. And more often than not, those folks are simply just a slave to the spreadsheet, a slave to the P&L. And so even more so, it's not about what you do, but for those people, it's about understanding what are the metrics that they're measured by and how can you impact those metrics within their department or within their company. And one other thing that I would just add to that is that your economic buyer is very rarely the CEO, going up to the very top. Those people are charged with looking out 2 years or 3 years ahead. And more often than not, you can acquire a budget without ever having to talk to the CEO, because those people have a whole list of priorities. And if you're not one of them, well, you shouldn't be taking time off their calendar. So as I mentioned before, everybody has a TAM. Everybody has multiple ICPs. And what we do at GrowthX in what is clearly the most important part of finding product market fit is we work with entrepreneurs to help them come up with and hypothesize multiple ideal customer profiles. That's step one. Because for most of us, those ICPs, those concepts, they're sitting in our head. We go and we have a meeting with our co-founder. We're talking about an idea. The juices really start going. And then we get to the coffee shop and we say, okay, well, what are you going to have? And all that fruitful conversation, it flies off into the air. So we take an approach where we get those thoughts down on paper into a specific templatized exercise, so that once you get each of those pieces down on paper, you can weigh them and compare them and see which one holds water and which ones, really don't make a whole lot of sense, or at least strategically don't make sense for you right now. And as you're building these ICPs, 5, 10, 15 of these concepts of ICPs, our North Star here is really simple. We're trying to maximize what we call traction effort delta. We're trying to maximize acquiring the most amount of revenue for the least amount of effort. And it's not the least amount of effort because we're lazy. No, absolutely not. Again, you have 3 full-time jobs. You have to focus on the lowest hanging fruit. Where can you reasonably acquire revenue given the constraints of your business? And with each ICP, we then begin to start thinking about what would it be like to acquire revenue from that ICP. So what we do is you have your ICP, you have your ideal customer profile. Now let's just start checking the boxes of all the things you're going to have to do in order to acquire revenue from that ICP, and just ask, is this reasonable? Am I setting myself up for success, or am I setting myself up for failure? So a perfect example I see quite regularly, you have an ideal customer profile. It's the enterprise ICP. Say, great, we're going to go after big companies. Wonderful. Average contract value will be somewhere around $150,000, $200,000. All we need is one deal. We'll make it happen. Well, here's the problem. Anybody who's been in business for a long time will tell you, the larger this number gets, the larger this number gets, the sales cycle. And it's pretty easy. You can go ahead and Google sales complexity matrix. You can almost set your watch by the average contract value and the time it'll take to close it. And at $150,000 or $200,000, you're talking about a 12 to 18 month sales cycle. Well, here's the problem with that. Your runway is 6 months. Maybe it's 8 months. Maybe it's 4. So right there with that ICP, you have a conflict. And it's an immovable object. You can't get over that conflict. And the way we just broke it down might seem fairly straightforward. But as long as I've been in venture capital, there's not been a week that goes by where I haven't met an entrepreneur raising a seed plus round or a pivot round where they say, listen, we learned that the enterprise sales cycles are too long. No, you didn't learn. You did exactly what so many failed startups here in Silicon Valley did, which is you hacked and you hustled, you shot first and asked questions later, and you chewed up your runway. And from an investor standpoint, what would make your behavior different with your next investment, right? So, another example, if I have an ideal customer profile and I take that average contract value down to $5,000, well, the time to close will be 3 to 6 weeks. Wonderful. Runway is still the same. The only problem is, in order to consistently protect that runway, I need a consistent pipeline. And that pipeline is going to be, if I just start working my way up the funnel, maybe 100 new leads every month. Well, does my team have the bandwidth to do that? If I'm only spending 10 or 15% of my time every week or every month even, which is pretty standard for most entrepreneurs on go-to-market and sales, those two just don't add up. And so something has to shift. Either that contract value or the amount of time that I put into the market, whatever it might be. But the main point of this is that, I can certainly empathize with the fact that all of this is a blurry object, right? And the challenge that each of us have that keeps us up at night as entrepreneurs is lack of certainty. Am I choosing the right direction? And is this the right market? Is this the right ideal customer profile? What do my customers want? First of all, as entrepreneurs, we don't get the luxury of certainty. If what we were doing was certain, then big corporations would be in here already driving a lot of revenue through it. But that said, there's a big gap between no certainty and acquiring signals to help you build the confidence to say, I think this is the right direction to go in. And I say this process, and I've experienced this process a lot like putting together a puzzle. You take the box, you empty the pieces, and at first it's very overwhelming because you go, boy, I don't know how to make sense of any of these pieces. But then what do? You find the edge pieces. And once you are able to start connecting on the edge pieces, you start to become much more familiar with all the other pieces and the orientation of those pieces because you're looking at every single one. It's the same thing with building your ideal customer profile and going to market. And you slow down and you actually start capturing consistent details and you fill in those edge pieces. Then you look at all the other pieces and you go, hey, does anyone have any bright yellow? It goes up in the top left-hand corner. Does anybody have any dark blue? It goes down in the bottom right-hand corner. And so the known steps to acquiring revenue are just those edge pieces. And what it just needs is for you to start filling in the ideal customer profile to be able to identify and test those pieces to say, with the limited amount of resources that I have, with the runway that I have, with the needs that I have to identify confidently if I'm in the right market or not, does this make sense? Mike, I want to do a quick time check. I know we're getting up on the top of the hour. Do we have, maybe another 5-10?
If you want to go over, I'm here for as long as there are questions or as long as it takes you to finish your presentation.
Brilliant. Awesome. So glad you said that. So how do we actually build that ICP? Well, it's fairly straightforward. This is part of the template and the exercise that we use. So you pick out that ideal industry, those ideal companies. Within those companies, you start identifying the right departments. Where's the budget actually going to come from? And what it gets down to, again, is the influencer level. Who is the economic buyer? And the challenge for each of you is to not only understand the keystrokes of that economic buyer. What are the roles? What's the responsibility? The most important part for each of you is to understand, how are they measured? What are the metrics of your economic buyer? You want to know the answer to the age-old question, well, hey, what keeps you up at night? It's the metrics. It's that number that you're kept up at night thinking, well, am I doing my job or am I not doing my job? And whether you're the CEO of a company or you're the head of facilities and maintenance, every single one of us has metrics. And when you can tie a direct line of correlation between what your product or service does and those metrics, then you'll be able to, first of all, identify the early signs of a validated ideal customer profile. But when you can get actual customers to say, this solves a metric problem for me, then that's what creates need. That's what goes beyond interest. That's what actually starts moving deals forward. And by the way, how do you find those metrics? Well, here's the brilliant part of all of this. LinkedIn will tell you what those metrics are. So what we do with entrepreneurs as we're coming up with these ICPs, as we're trying to validate them, is we go onto LinkedIn and we find these very specific titles, and you read people's profiles and they tell you in incredibly clear and explicit detail, this is what I do and this is how I do it, and these are the 4 to 5 things I'm responsible for. And if you don't find the clearest answers there, you don't even have to leave LinkedIn. You can click on the jobs button and start searching for people hiring those roles, and they'll tell you in even more excruciating detail. And what you're doing is you're reverse engineering that path to the reasons why they would buy, the problems that you're solving for, and you're seeing if you can solve for those key metrics. And if you can do that, then you'll understand and you'll be able to communicate the value that you create and the business issues that they're running into. So briefly, and I'll just sprint through this a little bit, let me just give you a tangible example of how this works for us. This is Aptology. This is a company that I'm invested in that I took through the MXP and accelerated. And for Aptology, they're a behavioral analytics platform. Effectively, they enable much more data-based employee engagement and hiring. So what's exciting about Aptology from an investor standpoint is what is absolutely terrifying about Aptology being effectively the first sales hire for them, which is everybody needs this, right? Everybody hires the same way. You get a bunch of resumes in, and the recruiter goes, well, I like what college she went to. I don't like the company he worked with. She has a gap in work history. He's on a growth career path. And the most common example where all this goes wrong is this person has a different name than I'm used to seeing, right? And these are all subjective, feeling-based hiring decisions. None of them have anything to do or are predictive about somebody's performance. So for Aptology, the question was, in the entire market of everyone who hires, what are we really looking for? What's our beachhead? What's our traction effort delta? And it was really simple. When you break down, we step away from our product for a minute, what are we solving for? Subjective hiring decisions. Who's going to have the biggest pain when it comes to subjective hiring decisions? People making expensive subjective hiring decisions. How much further can we push that pain? People making a high frequency of subjective hiring decisions. So when you think about that, that actually scopes us down quite a bit. Data engineers, scientists, lawyers, software engineers, doctors, these people don't get hired subjectively. They have to take tests, they have to get degrees, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at enterprise salespeople, there's no degree, there's no certification. Just because you're good at one company doesn't mean you'll be good at another company. If these people get compensated very well and they get hired a lot. So that's where we got started. Mid-market and enterprise technology companies, large sales teams, minimum 100 sales reps. Why 100 sales reps in that minimum? First of all, we're controlling for the product and the use case. If we go below that 100, then the outcome of the product and the data it creates becomes less effective, becomes less predictive. And I don't want to put my product in a place where it's just going to be unsuccessful, because then I'm not going to keep that customer. The second reason we looked at companies that were minimum 100 sales reps is because that was a great indicator of frequency. If you only had 20 or so sales reps, well, maybe you hired 5 or 6 a year. But if you had 100, that means you were spending, way over $1 million a year on hiring. And one of the things that we found as we were, researching this ICP is that the cost of a bad sales hire to an enterprise is about $150,000 to $200,000 per hire. Cost of a bad sales hire at the managerial level is around $1.5 million. So make no mistake, frequency is an incredibly positive indicator of how companies are losing money and spending money on the wrong hires. What else did we look for in our ideal company profile? We looked for companies that were high profile companies for hiring and for culture and for sales teams. So companies that had 5 out of 5 Glassdoor ratings, companies that were listed best places to work, best company culture, best in hiring practices. Why did we focus on these companies? Well, this is where it gets back to that worldview question. Those companies that are the best places to work, they didn't get there on accident. They didn't get there just because they've got a great company culture. They got there by spending money on that, by spending money on the right practices and the right people. And you started seeing things like chief people officer, chief cultural officer. Those are executive level people who have 6-figure salaries. And you better believe if I provide them with a new solution that improves culture, that improves retention, that improves quota, these people are going to pay attention to it and they're comfortable deploying budget because they've seen that it works. We look at the department, look at sales and human resources. When we look at the influencers, there were several. We focused on the CRO. When we looked at the business issues for the CRO, it's really simple. If I help you hire the right salesperson, they're going to hit quota. They're going to make sure that you make money. If you hire the wrong salesperson, they won't hit quota. I'm going to have to let them go. And so that's going to increase my cost per hire. It means you're going to lose money and they're not going to make enough money. So again, if I help you hire the right person, you're going to make money and save money. Going back to those tangible reasons why people buy. So what all that boiled down to was a very simple elevator pitch. And this was actually our cold email template. Aptology helps CROs at industry-leading technology companies increase revenue while decreasing the cost per new hire through our predictive hiring technology. And what made this elevator pitch so incredibly effective and also really easy to write was going through the exercise of crafting this ICP, was going through the exercise of reading the LinkedIn profiles of over 200 CROs and being able to bake into it increase revenue while decreasing cost per new hire. Those aren't my words. What I'm doing is I'm reflecting, I'm mirroring the words that I captured off of those 200 LinkedIn profiles. And I'm saying to this audience, I know what you do. I work with people very similar to you, and I help them solve for the thing that keeps them up at night. All this is a fancy Mad Lib. And what you have to do as the entrepreneurs, you have to go pick out the right words, right? You have to start mirroring and get close enough to your ideal customer that you can communicate with them, not so much about what you do, but what you do for them. And there's no way where you can answer the question, what you do for them, if you don't take the time to define who them are. That's the goal of all of this. Again, your ICP is the most important asset because it directs traffic of that pricing strategy, that messaging strategy. The more targeted you are, the more relevant you'll be, the less wasted motion and runway you'll have when you're trying to acquire a customer. And a big part of this that I see as the struggle for most entrepreneurs is we have to stop talking about customer acquisition. We have to stop taking this spray and pray approach where essentially the primary go-to-market strategy is hope that somebody will raise their hand and say, oh, I'm interested, right? When you really narrow down on acquiring your beachhead, a tangible, narrow sub-segment of customers that match your company's resources, your product's readiness, and your runway, right? The shot clock on your business, that's when you're able to create predictability and repeatability. And that's where investor readiness comes from. When you can demonstrate a tangible traction narrative and you can clearly communicate that they're not investing in hope, that an investor is not investing in the potential of your business if you figure it out, but that an investor would be investing in a company that is currently capital constrained. We're growing, but we can't grow enough because we need the money man in the building, right? You can only do that through traction, through revenue, and having demonstrable revenue, predictable revenue. And that is where we get back to, the focus of all this is having a tangible definition of product market fit. So I'll wrap up there. I know I went super long. There's so much still to even cover there, but I'm super grateful for the time. I'm happy to stay on longer as well and answer any questions. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we do at GrowthX and the MXP, which is an incredibly hands-on, thoughtful, methodical way for any entrepreneur to start growing revenue with intent, to start shortening those sales cycles, just starting to make sense of customer acquisition. It's not academic, it's not theoretical. This is how we grow our own portfolio companies. So, my email is no mystery. I'm just Max at GrowthX. Happy to speak with anybody. This is also how we meet potential investment companies. Our most recent investment, who we're raising a Series A for right now, we took them through this process, and then 6 months later, we're going from first investment to Series A, came from a workshop just like this. And Julius did his ICP worksheet based off of this workshop. And we started talking together and said, this is the diamond in the rough. And we've been thrilled to invest in it since. So I say that just to say, we're totally open. Love to hear from folks, love to hear feedback, and would also love to hear, any questions that anybody has.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Max. And for all the people that I've been speaking so highly about Max too, hopefully you can see why. And he said it perfectly, that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. This program that they've created, this acceleration program, is over 13 plus hours of nothing but this, and even more in detail. There's templates and case studies to go through to really provide more in-depth knowledge and practice. There wasn't too many questions in the chat, but Sean does ask, Can you talk a little about the acceleration program, cost and time? And just a heads up too, that I am trying to figure out a way where we can do some potential stipending through Amplify. So
Yeah.
keep that in mind too. But Max, can you answer a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, oftentimes whenever we put the word acceleration, near us, people bring with it a lot of other words and luggage. It's not an accelerator program. There's no applications. You can start any time. You can do it at your own pace. That said, what we focus on at GrowthX through the MXP is not giving you a curriculum so that you can acquire a certificate. That's a waste of your time, right? What this is focusing on is giving you the framework to actually go to market. If you do the market acceleration program, you are going to take your product to market, meet your customers, and acquire revenue, assuming that there's a market there, right? And so the biggest ingredient here is time. And I don't mean, how many months will it take? Because the program, you have access for a year to do it. That's not the issue. It's not about length of time. It's about consistency and intensity of the time that you put in, not to our program, but to your market. And the first step of the MXP is actually what we call resource review. And what we do is we get entrepreneurs to actually sit down and just think about and calculate how much of your time every week, every month are you actually putting into customer acquisition? And the reason why we start with that is just so that we're all on the same page to acknowledge that, listen, nobody starts a business for it to be unprofitable. Nobody starts a business for it to be a failure, right? So I assume that most entrepreneurs have certain beliefs, certain goals within their business: IPO, Series A, seed fundraising. Well, here's the thing. All of those goals and beliefs, they're driven at the end of the day, from the investor perspective, by revenue. And so if you are not putting the time, carving the time out of your calendar to invest in revenue, and it has to be a daily activity, then those actions and behaviors just simply won't match your beliefs. And it doesn't matter if you go through MXP or Lean Stack or anything else, until there is the actual explicit acknowledgement that something has to change, specifically the way we prioritize the acquisition of revenue within our organization. Again, all too often, there's too much time spent doing product development and doing pitch deck development and 10 other different shiny objects. And that thing called revenue, which will keep your business alive, again, it's an episodic thing. Until that becomes a consistent effort, those goals will continue to get pushed off, right? And every day where we don't get to market, where we don't write an email or craft a pitch or prospect 5 new customers to trickle into the top of our funnel, that's a day in the future where we steal from our own business either an opportunity to learn or an opportunity to earn, to acquire revenue. So the cost is directly on our website. It's really not a whole lot, but the time aspect of it is, typically we see companies that are really committed to putting in the time, they start seeing significant and more importantly, sustainable revenue come through, 2, sometimes 3 months. And the biggest learning that I've had since actually launching just the online version of this is that most companies are sitting on revenue and they don't even know it. It's not about launching a new email campaign, hiring a salesperson, spending an extra couple $1,000s on ads every month. A lot of it is about cutting out the wasted motion, getting those unqualified conversations off your calendar so that you can do anything else other than waste the time, and being thoughtful and intentional with each of the conversations you do have with the people who are actually qualified. So that's a little bit about the time aspect to it. And again, definitely feel free to check out our website. We've got plenty more information on how to sign up.
What other questions do we have for Max? And feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like.
I'll go if no one else has one. Is that okay, Mikey?
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Natalia Bishop. I am the founder and CEO of Level Up, and we are a platform helping content creators share their skills and knowledge online. So essentially, we are B2B, but it's a really small B on the other side. And so my question for you would be, when you are selling to small business owners, when it's oftentimes either a tiny team or a solopreneur, and typically these are creative entrepreneurs as well, you're sort of teetering between both the emotional side of things as well as the, hey, what is the ultimate goal? And we're having a little bit of a hard time with getting that feedback and really nailing this. Are we measuring through engagement, or are we measuring through a revenue item of, like, so what would be your advice for really capturing that customer and really understanding a metric that helps us say to investors, okay, here it is, this is how often they're coming, or they're paying this much a month. Volume, we have bootstrapped the whole way, so we can't really compete with the larger just yet. So I don't know, I would love your advice there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you, we actually invested in a similar platform that was previously known as Content Tools. It's now known as Growth Hackers. So I've certainly been in that space myself. So a couple of pieces of that. You have customers today, yeah? So first thing I would do is, before you look outward, look inward and stop all activities. Get an Excel list of all your current customers, and with a fine-tooth comb, just start going through each and every one of them and asking a really succinct set of standardized questions. Where did this person come from? What kind of agency are they running? How much content do they create? What's the size of their team, right? How often do they stay engaged? What's their NPS score? How good of a customer that they are? Why do you start with this activity? It sounds really straightforward, but again, for most of us, we're on the hamster wheel. We're going more. We're creating data within our business, and we think we're running data-driven businesses, but what we don't appreciate about data is that data is raw. You have to synthesize, you have to digest data. You got to milk data, right? Otherwise, it's just the puzzle pieces are smacked all over the room. I mean, literally think about that for a second. If you're in your office and there are puzzle pieces everywhere, you're going to avoid picking them up for a while, because this is just going to take a while, right? But what's nice is that the picture will come together. And this is actually one of the first steps that we take in the MXP before we even build an ICP, especially if you already have revenue, because what you'll see is your ICP reveal itself. What you're going to see is high value customers who come through with very little effort and go, I love your product. And then what you do is you flip that around and you go, how many more of those customers are out there? And what you'll also do is you'll also identify the bad fit customers. There's going to be a pattern of people who churn. Some of those people are going to churn for solvable reasons. You know what? We had a bug that week. Or you know what? That was our old pricing model, but they fit our ICP. So that's actually our new price model. Again, when I talk about you might be able to see revenue in a month or two, those are those leaked opportunities that are all over the place. But you also understand who are just those bad fit customers. They actually don't fit our ICP. So I start there to sort of clarify, what are you doing and how are you doing it? And then as it relates to the investor conversation, now you go, all right, I have a pretty good idea of who my ICP is. So let me see if I can hit, a shot clock, a timer, and go, this is my ICP. Can I, now that I understand that, start to acquire that exact type of customer consistency? And what that demonstrates to an investor is that you have control. You have control of who your customers are, why you want to acquire those customers, the price point you want to acquire them, and ultimately their success being your customer. And if you can continue that path and acquire those customers consistently over a few months, now you have a traction narrative. And especially a business like yours, which, I totally appreciate what you're saying. It's sort of B2B, B2C. So you're probably doing a little bit more digital marketing than a traditional B2B business would do. What's great about that is you put yourself in a position to go, I'm absolutely a capital constrained business. All I need is your dollars to fund my ad budget, right? And then you're off and running, which is a very powerful position to be in from from an entrepreneur standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Thank you so much. We've been running a lot of like customer job to be done interviews, one-on-ones with them, but I never really thought about like, hey, let's put them all, categorize them, figure out exactly what each are doing, and figure out what are those traits. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, your existing customers oftentimes are the key. For those of you who are post-revenue, existing customers, we oftentimes acquire them and then sort of walk away. They are so often the absolute keystone to informing who our future customers can be, because the grand experiment, the first experiment is, can I get someone to pay me money and stay as my customer and be happy? And if you can do that, now you've solved for the bottom of the funnel. So you know that somebody will do it. Now, experiment number 2 is, can I repeat that action? And I think where a lot of founders fall short is they try to repeat that, but they change the customer variable. It's a different person, it's a different archetype, it's a different persona, whatever it is, and they're changing the experiment but expecting the same result. That doesn't make sense, right? So you hold that ICP constant and you see if you can't then start making that process more streamlined.
That reminds me of a case study where they talked about Velveeta cheese and super users. Kind of goes over the 80-20 rule a little bit, but basically Velveeta cheese really targeted the people who used their cheese in very unique ways, like putting it on hamburgers or putting it on tacos. Someone created fudge out of it. That's a weird one. But kind of targeting that 80-20 rule of how people use your product. But
and to that point, there's a great example actually with a Canadian health foods company that I was working with that was pivoting into plant-based foods, and they created plant-based food for kids. And as I alluded to earlier, when I met with them, they had actually developed this product about 2 years ago. Sales were totally flat. They were about to just they were about to just throw away the entire experiment. And we just got into their marketing team and said, okay, well, who's your persona? Who's your ideal buyer? And they said, moms. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Let's just think about which moms would, like, moms is your future ICP, moms is your TAM. Let's just get practical, tactical here. Who is most likely to buy a plant-based food for their kid? The mom who shops at Whole Foods or the mom who shops at Walmart? That's not rocket science, right? It's the mom who shops at Whole Foods. It's probably then the mom who shops at Whole Foods, who's in a couple of very specific, organic food and planet conscious Facebook groups, and who are the Instagram influencers who espouse those types of things. Again, you start reverse engineering those digital breadcrumbs, and you get hyper focused on that lowest hanging fruit. And that was a while ago. And now that company has seen consistently their product is selling out at Whole Foods, and they're no longer shipping it to Walmart where it wasn't, moving off the shelf at all. Just think about what the data was informing them, right? They're going like, well, our sales are only this, so it must not be very attractive. Well, if you put your product in front of people who are not your customers, yeah, you're not going to sell very much of it.
That actually goes right into my question about those moms, and especially for maybe new startups that have 5 or less people, or maybe 10 or less people. You mentioned how you also want to maximize the revenue per each ICP. When you are first launching, how many different ICPs should you hypothesize with or test with at launch? Obviously you can't do 100 different mom ICPs. You got to narrow it down to figure out how to maximize that revenue. But how many should a 10-person or less team try to hypothesize with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we go pretty deep into this in our ICP module. But the first thing I'll say is these are all a series of steps. And at each step, again, you're not going to get certainty to any of this. The only person you need to convince is yourself. Yeah, this is enough signal for me to invest a little bit more time with this specific ICP, right? So you go through these exercises, start weeding out the bad, and then start verifying the good, and then start to identify and select what feels like the best. And hopefully you collect enough data where that feeling at least is much more well-informed than your gut. So starting with sort of stage one brainstorming, there's no limit to that. But typically what we do is in the realm of what's reasonable is about 10 ICPs, 10 different ICPs. And sometimes they can actually be hyper-focused, but just very nuanced and specific differences. And sometimes it can be like manufacturing versus IT, big companies, small companies. So it can certainly run the gamut. But I want to be absolutely clear, you can brainstorm as many as you want. When it comes to taking the product to market, one ICP. And that goes almost entirely just back to resources. If you don't have enough resources to actually fund and properly get after one market, you're certainly not going to do that effectively with two. And let's just go back to how the experiment would immediately be corrupted by having two ICPs. If you have two ICPs, who does your website communicate to? If I had two ICPs at Aptology, I now can't say Aptology helps CROs and industry-leading technology companies. So I'm going to dilute my website, and I'm probably going to dilute my email copy. So what am I testing? The only thing I'm testing is that if I'm unclear with my market, that I'm intentionally creating friction that's going to impact my metrics, that's going to impact the interest, that's going to impact my ability to have at-bats, opportunities to learn and earn. So I can't possibly stress this enough. There's plenty of space at the top of the funnel as far as ideation goes to come up with lots and lots of ICPs. And again, there will be no certainty, but as you take sort of these micro steps towards validation, again, go into that LinkedIn exercise I told you. If you read these metrics, and you go, I don't think we impact any of these metrics, or I don't even think we impact any of the ones that are priority. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you get in front of that CRO and you tell them, look, I solved this problem for you. It's like the 7th thing on your list. So how easy is it going to be to get on their calendar or to get them to spend money with you? It's not going to be very easy, right? It's not terribly illogical. And I think that the biggest challenge that a lot of us have is we've now been conditioned by Amazon and blog posts, right? Amazon gives us way too much instant gratification, right? I want to find the best camping chair. Did this literally yesterday. I want to find the best camping chair. Item number 1, 25,000 reviews. Great. Click, buy, problem solved. That's not how market development is done. That's not how customer acquisition is done. It takes a lot of thoughtful research. From the blog standpoint, the really screwy thing for us entrepreneurs is that we are constantly being bombarded and marketed to by people telling us, 2 things I did to raise $1 billion, or 3 email hacks anybody can do to win a deal. It's not real, right? What are they doing? They're marketing to you. They're giving you something quick that will hopefully get you started so that they can bring you into their funnel and they can sell you some stuff. But any of those people that had that successful, one-liner, that CTA, that question, I can promise you the reason why that strategy was successful was not just because they were innovative, but it was primarily first because they knew exactly who their market was. They didn't try it on everybody and were successful. They tried it on their target market and they noticed a significant bump. And that piece is lost. And it's difficult. It's a personal journey for all of us where we're sitting there getting our butts kicked, looking at runway moving out, and our Facebook and our Twitter and our LinkedIn feeds are, racing with people talking about how successful that they are. Well, it's just take a deep breath and realize that it's not all that it's meant. It's not all that that's pictured out to be in our social feeds.
Thank you for that, Max. Any other questions? Maybe we have time for maybe one more. Okay, well, awesome. I hit stop on the recording.